It began on a night when the wind itself seemed to howl with grief. Chicago, 1934. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and gasoline, the sky veiled in a gray mist that hung over the city like a curse. Somewhere on the edge of Barrington Road, a car sat smoking, riddled with bullet holes. Inside, a man bled out onto the torn leather seat, his face pale, his breath shallow. And beside him, hands trembling, eyes hard, sat a woman whose name history would not soon forget. Helen Gillis, the gun moll who wouldn't run, the last woman standing in the blood-soaked saga of America's outlaw era. But before the newspapers painted her as a legend, before the world saw her as a criminal, Helen was just another girl from Chicago's West Side. Born in 1911 to Polish immigrants, she grew up in a working-class neighborhood where life was simple but never easy. Her father worked long hours in a factory, coming home with the smell of smoke and iron clinging to his clothes. Her mother sewed by candlelight, her hands rough from the needle, her eyes weary but kind. They were honest people in a dishonest time, trying to survive the wreckage of the Great Depression. Helen learned early that dreams didn't come cheap. The world wasn't kind to those who waited patiently for good fortune. It was built for the ones who took it. She was smart, quiet, observant, and beautiful in that effortless way that made men stop talking when she entered a room. But she wasn't one to chase attention. She watched. She listened. She understood people, especially the kind who thought they could hide their motives behind a smile. There was something in her eyes that could cut through pretense, a clarity that saw the world for what it was, a place where survival meant choosing your alliances carefully. As a teenager, she found herself drawn to the pulse of the city. Chicago in the 1920s and early 30s was alive with contradictions. Speakeasies hidden behind bakery doors, jazz music spilling out of back rooms where liquor flowed like water, and the constant hum of police sirens echoing through the night. Crime wasn't just an occupation. It was an economy, a way of life. The newspapers were filled with names that became modern myths. Al Capone, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd. They were men who had risen from poverty to power, men who had taken what they wanted and dared the world to stop them. To a young woman watching from the sidelines, there was something intoxicating about that kind of defiance. Helen didn't plan to fall for a gangster. Fate, it seemed, had its own cruel sense of irony. She met Lester Joseph Gillis at a neighborhood dance hall one summer night in 1929. He was small, barely 5'4", but there was nothing timid about him. He had a boyish grin, slicked back hair, and a confidence that filled the room like smoke. People said he could charm the devil himself, and when Helen locked eyes with him, she understood why. He asked her to dance, and from that moment, the rest of the world faded away. He wasn't famous yet. To her, he was just Lester, a mechanic by trade, a dreamer by nature. They spent hours walking along the lakefront, talking about the future, about escaping the grip of poverty that held their families hostage. He spoke of cars and speed, of living without fear, of taking control of life before it took control of them. She laughed at his wild plans, but something in his words thrilled her. He made her believe there was more to the world than factory whistles and pay envelopes that never stretched far enough. By the time they married, Helen had no illusions about the man she had chosen. Lester was already dabbling in small-time robberies and bootlegging, earning a reputation in the Chicago underworld as reckless but effective. The law called him a menace. His friends called him Babyface for his youthful looks and deceptively innocent smile. Helen called him husband. Together, they built a life balanced precariously between domestic normalcy and the growing chaos of crime. Their home was modest, a small apartment with worn furniture and curtains Helen had sewn herself. On the surface, they looked like any other young couple struggling through hard times. But behind those curtains, secrets were buried. There were guns hidden beneath floorboards, maps tucked away in kitchen drawers, cash wrapped in oil paper and stuffed inside the lining of their mattress. Helen learned the unspoken code of the criminal life. Trust no one, speak little, and always have an exit plan. The first time Lester came home with blood on his shirt, Helen didn't ask whose it was. She simply helped him wash it out. Love, she realized, wasn't always gentle. Sometimes it was sharp-edged, forged in danger and loyalty. She didn't see herself as an accomplice. She saw herself as a wife doing what needed to be done. The world was cruel to women like her, women who loved too deeply, who followed their hearts even when it led them into darkness. As Lester's crimes escalated, so did their notoriety. The newspapers began printing their names, pairing them with words like bandit, killer, and outlaw. Helen saw her husband transform from a restless dreamer into something harder, colder. Each robbery, each close call seemed to feed his hunger for power. Yet, when he looked at her, he softened, if only for a moment. She was his anchor, the one person who reminded him he was still human. But humanity is fragile in the underworld. As the Great Depression deepened, crime became both a profession and a declaration of war against the system. The banks that had crushed ordinary people under debt became targets for men like Nelson. To him, every heist was payback. To Helen, it was survival. She knew the risks, the price that came with loving a man who lived by the gun, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. Every time she thought about leaving, she remembered that night at the dance hall, the way his hand had felt on hers, the promise in his smile. She started taking on small roles in his operations, scouting locations, delivering messages, driving when needed. She was a quick learner, calm under pressure, and loyal beyond measure. The men respected her, not just because she was Nelson's wife, but because she was capable. She never complained, never hesitated, even when bullets flew. In time, she earned a name of her own among the outlaw circles. Helen the Mute, some called her, because she never said more than she had to. Others called her the Loyal One. Life on the run became their normal. From Chicago to Reno, from San Antonio to Sioux Falls, Helen and Lester moved like shadows, changing names and disguises as often as others changed clothes. She dyed her hair, learned to keep a suitcase packed at all times, and slept with one eye open. Each new town offered a few days of peace before the cycle of paranoia began again. But for Helen, peace was never the point. What mattered was staying together. There were moments, brief and fragile, when they almost seemed like an ordinary couple. Sunday mornings spent drinking coffee on a porch they'd soon have to abandon, stolen kisses before a job, laughter echoing through cheap motel walls. But even those moments carried an edge, a tension that never quite disappeared. Helen could feel the danger creeping closer each day, could sense that something inevitable was waiting for them at the end of the road. Lester was changing. The thrill that once made him alive was now turning him into a storm. His temper grew shorter, his decisions more reckless. He didn't just want to rob banks anymore. He wanted to take on the FBI itself. He saw himself as untouchable, a living ghost that the law could never catch. Helen tried to reason with him, but the more she pleaded for caution, the more he laughed it off. "We don't get to grow old, baby," he once told her, lighting a cigarette and staring out into the night. "Not people like us. We live fast, or we don't live at all." Sometimes, when he slept, she'd study his face, the boyish features that had once fooled the world into thinking he was harmless. She'd trace the scar near his jaw, the mark from a bullet that had come too close. She wondered what it would be like to have a quiet life, far from the sound of sirens. But when morning came, and he smiled that same dangerous smile, she knew she'd follow him anywhere. There were times when the guilt crept in. She thought of the families whose lives were torn apart by the violence that followed them. She thought of her parents, who had raised her to be honest, and wondered what they would think if they could see her now. But love has its own logic, and Helen's was the kind that refused to die. In her heart, she still saw the boy who had asked her to dance, not the outlaw who made headlines. As the months passed, the law's net began to tighten. The FBI, now led by J. Edgar Hoover, was determined to wipe out the last of the Depression-era gangsters. Dillinger was gone, Floyd was dead, and babyface Nelson had become public enemy number one. Helen knew it couldn't last. No one outran death forever, but she never left his side. When others deserted him, she stayed. When bullets flew, she didn't flinch. She had made her choice long ago, and she would see it through to the end. Looking back, it's easy to see the tragedy that was coming. Two people bound by love and destruction, caught in a dance they couldn't escape. But in those early days, before the gunfire and the manhunts, there was something almost poetic about them. Two souls who wanted to carve their own destiny in a world that offered them none. Helen didn't see herself as a criminal. She saw herself as a survivor, a woman standing beside the only person who had ever made her feel alive. And maybe that's why she never ran. Not when the walls closed in, not when the law branded her a fugitive, not even when she watched the man she loved bleed out beneath a winter sky. Because for Helen Gillis, loyalty was more than love. It was her identity, her armor, her curse. The girl from Chicago's backstreets had become something else entirely, a woman who had looked into the heart of violence and refused to look away. The story of Helen Gillis begins not with crime, but with choice. The choice to love a man the world feared, the choice to stand by him when every instinct said to flee, and the choice, above all, to live by her own code, no matter the cost. In the dark corners of America's gangster history, her name still lingers, not as a footnote, but as a testament to the kind of loyalty that burns brighter than fear and often leads straight to ruin. The years that followed blurred together like a reel of old film, scratched and fading at the edges. Chicago was no longer just home. It was a battlefield where ambition and blood shared the same streets. For Helen Gillis, life had shifted from whispered dreams to roaring chaos. The once gentle hum of streetcars was replaced by the rumble of getaway engines and the echo of gunfire bouncing off brick walls. She had married a man who refused to live quietly, and now she was trapped inside the whirlwind of his legend. Lester Joseph Gillis, better known now as Babyface Nelson, was no longer just a small-time hood. The boy who once fixed cars in the neighborhood garage had transformed into a name that made even seasoned criminals step aside. His charm was still there, that dangerous smile that seemed to promise adventure, but it was sharper now, colder. Power had a way of changing a man, and Nelson wore it like a second skin. He had learned that fear could get him what respect never could, and he used it with precision. But beneath that rage, beneath the violence and swagger, Helen could still see the same restless boy who once talked about beating the world at its own game. In the early 1930s, the country was bleeding. Banks were collapsing, men were jumping from rooftops, and families were starving. The law was failing the people, and gangsters stepped in to fill the void. To some, they were villains. To others, they were folk heroes, stealing from institutions that had already robbed the poor. Nelson didn't rob banks out of any noble sense of justice. He did it because he could. Because it thrilled him. Because it made him feel alive. Helen had seen him come home after a job, his eyes glowing with the rush of it, the kind of high no drink or drug could give. He'd throw a wad of cash onto the table, pull her close, and say, "See, baby, this is what winning feels like." She'd smile, pretending not to notice the blood on his collar or the tremor in his hands. She had stopped asking how many people had been hurt, stopped wondering how many bullets had been fired. Questions were dangerous in their world, and silence had become her refuge. When Nelson joined up with John Dillinger's gang, Helen's life took another turn. Dillinger was already a legend, a name that stirred both fear and admiration. To the public, he was a charming outlaw who robbed banks with style and never hurt the innocent. To those who knew him, he was something more, a strategist, a man who could plan a heist like a symphony. Helen met him once in a safe house just outside of St. Paul. He greeted her like an old friend, tipping his hat with a grin that could melt steel. He treated her with respect, even kindness, something not all gangsters extended to the wives and girlfriends of their partners. But there was tension beneath the surface. Dillinger saw Nelson's recklessness as a liability, and Nelson saw Dillinger's calm as arrogance. Helen could sense it, the way Nelson's jaw tightened whenever Dillinger gave an order, the way he'd mutter under his breath afterward. He hated being in someone else's shadow. He wanted to be the one calling the shots, the one whose name echoed through the papers. And soon enough he would be. Their jobs grew bigger, bolder, more dangerous. Banks in South Dakota, Minnesota, and Indiana fell to their gang like dominoes. The money flowed freely, and for a brief moment it seemed like they had won. Helen and Lester stayed in fancy hotels under fake names, dressed in the latest fashions, and dined in restaurants that would have once turned them away. She wore silk dresses and pearls, but she never forgot the weight of the pistol she kept hidden beneath her coat. They could play at being royalty, but they both knew it was only an act. The first time Helen killed a man, or at least believed she might have, was on a dusty back road in Iowa. They were ambushed by a deputy while switching cars after a heist. Nelson fired first, but in the chaos a second gun went off. Helen didn't even remember pulling the trigger. The deputy fell and she froze, staring at the smoke rising from her weapon. Nelson grabbed her hand, dragged her back into the car, and they sped away. He didn't speak for miles, just drove with that manic grin plastered across his face. When he finally looked at her, he said, "You did good, baby. You're one of us now." That night, she cried quietly in the dark while Nelson slept beside her, his arm draped over her like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Something inside her had shifted, something she couldn't undo. She had crossed the line from witness to participant, from victim to accomplice, and deep down, a small part of her accepted it. Because there was no going back. Not now. The FBI began closing in, their tactics growing more ruthless with each passing week. Hoover's agents were relentless, and the newspapers were eating it up. Every chase, every shootout, every corpse left behind became front-page news. Nelson's fame turned toxic. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a hunted man. Helen felt the fear pressing in on them, a constant weight that never lifted. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Every shadow looked like the start of the end. Still, she stayed. When others deserted him, Helen remained. She was his lookout, his driver, his shield. There were times when he raged, when his temper exploded like a storm, and she'd have to step between him and whoever had dared to challenge him. He scared her sometimes, not because she thought he'd hurt her, but because she saw how much darkness was taking root in him. He had become consumed by the idea that he couldn't die, that fate owed him something. She wanted to believe it too, but the truth was catching up. One winter night, while hiding out in Wisconsin, Helen and Nelson sat by a fire in a small cabin borrowed from a friend of a friend. Outside, snow fell quietly, muffling the world. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and exhaustion. Nelson cleaned his guns methodically while Helen watched the flames dance. "You ever think about what happens when it's over?" she asked softly. He looked up, amused. "Over? What's that supposed to mean?" "When we can't run anymore. When they catch us." He laughed, shaking his head. "They won't catch us. They're too slow, too stupid. We're ghosts, Helen. You and me. We're untouchable." But she saw it then, the faint flicker of fear behind his bravado. He wasn't untouchable. He was mortal, bleeding just like everyone else. She wanted to tell him to stop, to disappear somewhere, start over. But even as the words formed in her mind, she knew he'd never listen. His pride wouldn't let him. For Nelson, surrender was worse than death. The following spring, Dillinger was killed outside the Biograph Theater, shot down in a hail of bullets after being betrayed by someone he trusted. Helen remembered the news flashing across the radio, the announcer's voice trembling with excitement as he described the death of America's most famous outlaw. She watched Nelson's reaction closely. He didn't flinch. He just smirked and said, "Guess I'm the last one left." But she knew what he was really thinking. If Dillinger could fall, so could he. The net was tightening. The FBI had new agents, new weapons, and a new sense of vengeance. They weren't just hunting criminals. They were hunting symbols. And Nelson was now the biggest target of them all. As their circle of allies shrank, the tension grew unbearable. Every morning felt like it could be their last. Helen began keeping a bag packed at all times, ready to flee at a moment's notice. She stopped sleeping through the night, listening instead for cars on the gravel, footsteps outside the door. Sometimes, when Nelson was gone on jobs, she'd sit by the window and watch the horizon, wondering if he'd come back, or if the next knock would be the law telling her he never would. Then came the job that would change everything. A bank in South Bend, Indiana. It was supposed to be easy, a quick in and out. But things went wrong from the start. The alarm was tripped early, the police were faster than expected, and bullets filled the air before they even made it back to the car. Nelson took a shot to the shoulder but kept firing, dragging one of his wounded men to safety. Helen drove like a demon, tires screaming against the pavement as they tore out of town. The car windows shattered under the rain of gunfire, glass slicing her cheek. She didn't stop. Not until the sound of sirens faded into the distance. That night she cleaned Nelson's wound while he gritted his teeth in silence. His blood soaked through the towel, staining her hands crimson. "It's just a scratch," he muttered. But she knew better. He was getting slower, weaker. The man who once laughed at death now winced at its shadow. She wanted to scream, to make him see that they were running out of road. But all she could do was keep going, because to stop would mean admitting defeat, and neither of them were built for that. By now, Helen's name was known across the country. The newspapers called her the gun moll who wouldn't run. a title that both glorified and condemned her. They painted her as a dangerous beauty, the woman behind the monster. Some called her a victim, others called her a partner in crime, but none of them knew the truth. The quiet moments, the fear that came before every job, the love that had somehow survived beneath all the blood and chaos. She had become what the world demanded of her, strong, unflinching, and loyal to the very end. The girl who once dreamed of escaping poverty had found herself chained to a man the world would never forgive. But she didn't need forgiveness. All she needed was him. Their empire wasn't made of bricks or power. It was built on love, madness, and the fleeting illusion of freedom. And as the walls began to close in, Helen could feel the story hurtling toward its inevitable conclusion. She didn't know when or where it would happen, only that it would be violent and that she'd be there when it did. Because she always was, because she couldn't be anywhere else. The summer of 1934 carried a heat that felt like warning. The days were long and suffocating, and the nights offered little relief. Helen Gillis sat by the window of yet another safe house, her cigarette burning to ash between her fingers as she stared at the motionless fields beyond. Each town they passed through looked the same, quiet, ordinary, full of faces that had no idea the most wanted man in America was hiding just down the road. She used to feel comfort in that anonymity, the safety of being no one, but now it only felt hollow. Every time she looked at Lester, she saw a man unraveling. Every time he looked at her, she saw a reflection of the same. They were ghosts of their former selves, worn thin by the chase. The FBI posters plastered across post offices and gas stations made sure no one would ever forget their faces. Nelson's grin stared out from every bulletin board, his eyes defiant. His name stamped in black ink beneath the words, Public Enemy Number 1. Helen's picture sat just below his, smaller, softer, but no less dangerous in the eyes of the law. The woman who wouldn't run, they called her. She had read that headline once in a crumpled newspaper someone left behind at a diner. The words had made her chest tighten, not with pride, but with a strange kind of grief. In the beginning, being wanted had felt thrilling. The money, the attention, the sense of being untouchable, it was intoxicating. But now it was suffocating. They couldn't stay anywhere for more than a few nights. They couldn't trust anyone. Even among their few remaining allies, whispers of betrayal hung heavy. The old network that had once protected them was falling apart, fractured by fear and greed. The FBI had doubled its rewards, and for every loyal friend, there were 3 desperate men willing to sell information for a clean slate. Helen knew it was only a matter of time before someone gave them up. Nelson tried to hide the pressure behind that same reckless charm, but Helen could see it breaking through. His temper had become unpredictable. One moment he was calm and smiling, the next he was smashing a chair against the wall or firing his gun into the air just to feel in control. The man who had once been cunning and calculated was now driven by impulse. He would wake in the middle of the night, pacing the room, muttering about the FBI, about Hoover, about how they would never take him alive. Helen would watch him from the bed, her heart aching, knowing there was no reaching him when he was like that. And yet she stayed. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was the only life she knew how to live anymore. Maybe she couldn't tell the difference. In late October, they crossed into Wisconsin with John Paul Chase, one of Nelson's last loyal partners. The 3 of them drove through small towns, sleeping in barns, eating at roadside diners, and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize them. Helen had grown skilled at disguises, different hairstyles, new clothes, fake names. But there was only so much you could hide when your face had been printed in every newspaper from coast to coast. She had once joked that if she ever disappeared, no one would even know who to look for, because she had become so many people. But even jokes carried weight in their world. She wasn't sure who Helen Gillis was anymore. Nelson, meanwhile, was growing restless. He couldn't stand still. Every day without action felt like a cage closing in. The moment he caught wind of a bank or an armored car nearby, his pulse would quicken, his hands would twitch, and Helen would feel that familiar dread settle in her stomach. She tried to talk him out of it, reminding him of the heat, the danger, the fact that their faces were too well known now. But her words bounced off him like bullets on steel. "I'm not hiding," he'd snap. Not from them. Not from anybody. One night, as they sat in a cramped motel room with the radio humming low in the background, Helen finally asked him what he wanted. "You've got money. she said. "You've got me. What's left to prove?" He looked at her with that glint in his eye, the same one he'd had the first night they met. "It's not about proving anything," he said. "It's about not letting them win." "I'm not going out in cuffs, Helen. I won't give them the satisfaction." She said nothing after that. She understood him too well. For Nelson, living without freedom wasn't living at all. As the days passed, the tension between them and the outside world grew unbearable. Reports came in of agents swarming the Midwest, raiding hideouts, arresting anyone with even a whisper of connection to them. Each morning brought fresh headlines, each night a new fear. Helen barely slept. The exhaustion dug deep into her bones, but she couldn't afford to collapse. Nelson needed her steady. Chase needed her calm. She was the only thing tethering them to any semblance of sanity. Then came November 27th, 1934, the morning that sealed their fate. They were driving south on a narrow highway outside Barrington, Illinois, in a stolen Ford V8. The air was biting cold, and frost clung to the edges of the windshield. Helen sat in the back seat, her hands clasped in her lap, while Nelson drove and Chase watched the road behind them. The car was loaded with weapons, Thompsons, pistols, extra ammunition, everything they might need if things went wrong. And in their world, things always went wrong. As they passed through a small stretch of countryside, the engine began to sputter. Nelson cursed under his breath, pounding the steering wheel. They pulled over near a field, steam hissing from under the hood. Helen's stomach turned to ice. A broken-down car meant exposure, and exposure meant death. Nelson climbed out to check the engine, muttering about bad luck while Chase kept watch. Helen lit a cigarette, her fingers shaking. She didn't know then that this would be the last cigarette she'd ever smoke as a free woman. Minutes later, 2 cars appeared on the horizon, approaching fast. At first they looked like ordinary travelers, but the way they closed in, the way the sunlight glinted off something metallic, it was enough for Nelson to know. "Cops!" he hissed. The vehicle slowed, tires crunching against the gravel. From one of them, 2 men stepped out, dressed in suits and overcoats, their hands hovering near their holsters. Federal agents. Samuel Cowley and Herman Hollis. Hoover's best. Helen's heart pounded. She could taste the metallic tang of fear in her throat. "Lester," she whispered, "we can run. We can still make it." But Nelson just smiled, that cold, fearless grin. "No, baby. We finish it here." The air exploded. Gunfire tore through the quiet countryside, echoing across the fields like thunder. Nelson moved like lightning, firing his Thompson in short, deadly bursts. Bullets ripped through the agent's car, shattering glass and metal. Helen ducked behind the wheel well, the heat of the gunfire burning her skin. Chase was shouting, but she couldn't hear the words, only the relentless roar of weapons and the screaming wind. Cowley and Hollis fired back, their bullets striking Nelson in the legs and stomach, but he didn't stop. He advanced on them, one hand clutching his bleeding side, the other gripping the gun like it was part of him. Helen watched in horror as he unloaded the last of his ammunition into the agents, dropping both men where they stood. Then, as the last echo faded, Nelson stumbled. His face had gone pale, his breathing ragged. "Get in the car," he barked, collapsing against the door. Helen and Chase dragged him inside. The seat beneath him darkened with blood. His shirt clung to his chest, soaked through. Helen pressed her hands against the wounds, but it was no use. The blood kept coming, hot and steady, running between her fingers like water. She drove. God, how she drove. The car tore down the highway, engine screaming, tires spitting gravel. Nelson's head slumped against the window, his eyes half-lidded, his voice weak. "Don't stop," he murmured. Don't let them take me." Helen's vision blurred, but she didn't slow. Chase sat beside her, pale and silent, his hands gripping the dashboard. Every mile felt like a lifetime. She could smell the blood, feel its warmth soaking into her dress. Nelson tried to speak again, but the words came out as a broken whisper. You were good to me, baby. Better than I deserved." "Don't talk like that," she said through tears. "You're gonna make it. Just hold on." But deep down she knew. They both knew. They made it to a safe house in Niles Center just after dusk. Helen helped Nelson out of the car, his body trembling from the effort. Inside, they laid him on a bed, the room dim and silent except for his labored breathing. She knelt beside him, her hands still slick with his blood, whispering his name like a prayer. He tried to smile, that same crooked grin she'd fallen for all those years ago. "Guess Guess they got me after all, he said, his voice barely a breath. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Lester. They'll never get you. Not really. He reached for her hand, his fingers cold now. Promise me. You'll keep going. Don't let them break you. I promise, she said. And then, in that quiet room, as the night pressed against the windows and the world outside went still, Babyface Nelson took his final breath. Helen sat there long after the sound of it faded, the silence so deep it felt endless. When she finally stood, she wiped her face, kissed his forehead, and began the grim task of burying him. She dug into the frozen earth with her bare hands until her nails broke and the blood mixed with dirt. When it was done, she covered the grave and stood over it, her heart hollow, her body shaking. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. She turned away from the sound and walked back toward the car, every step heavier than the last. She didn't look back. She couldn't. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the legend of Babyface Nelson was already being written. The newspapers would tell their version. The blood, the chase, the fury, but none of them would understand the truth. They'd say Helen was cold, unfeeling, ruthless. But she wasn't. She was just a woman who loved a man too much to run, even when she should have. The days after Nelson's death were a blur of fear and silence. The world that once moved in rhythm with Helen's pulse had gone still, replaced by the cold hum of survival. She had buried the man who had been her lover, her partner in crime, her reason to keep breathing. Now the world around her felt empty, hollowed out by the weight of what she had done and what she had lost. The newspapers were filled with his name, every headline screaming it louder than the last. Babyface Nelson, dead in shootout. FBI agents killed in fiery gun battle. His death was treated like a victory, a triumph for law and order. But to Helen, it was just the end of something that had once been wild and alive. She hid in Chicago for a time, using an alias and changing addresses almost every night. The city that had once been her playground had turned into a maze of shadows and whispers. Every knock at the door made her flinch. Every face in a diner or passing by her on the street seemed to linger too long, eyes scanning, judging, maybe recognizing. The fear was constant, thick as the winter fog that clung to the city streets. She could feel the walls closing in with every passing hour. The bureau was everywhere now. Hoover's men were hunting down every known associate, every contact, every woman who had ever been seen with the gang. It wasn't just about Nelson anymore. The Bureau wanted to make an example of everyone tied to that era of crime. The Dillingers, the Barkers, the Pierponts, the Floyds. They were cleaning house, and Helen knew she was next. Her name was already in the papers. Her picture had been printed beside Nelson's for months. The woman who wouldn't run. The last of the gun malls. But Helen wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet, not after everything she'd been through. She still had his words ringing in her ears. Don't let them break you. And she wouldn't. Not until she had no other choice. For weeks, she moved like a shadow. She stayed with relatives under false names, taking shelter in basements, barns, and back rooms of people who either pitied her or feared her enough to keep quiet. Money was running thin, and most of what she had left was blood money, the kind that couldn't be spent without drawing attention. She would sit for hours in dimly lit rooms, replaying the past like a film she couldn't turn off. The banks, the getaways, the nights spent laughing in cheap motels, the sound of Nelson's voice calling her baby. She wasn't proud of what they'd done. She wasn't delusional about it, but she couldn't deny that it had been real, more real than anything else in her life. In those moments with him, she had felt alive in a way she never had before. And that kind of feeling didn't just fade. It burned, slow and deep, like a scar that never quite healed. Winter gave way to spring, and the net began to tighten. Hoover's agents traced Nelson's movements in the final weeks of his life, and the trail led straight to Helen. They questioned anyone who had ever known her, neighbors, friends, old classmates. They raided homes, followed rumors, and offered rewards to anyone willing to talk. Her name had become a curse. People who once greeted her with smiles now shut their doors when they saw her coming. Loyalty, she learned, was a fragile thing. By April of 1935, Helen was exhausted. She had been living like a fugitive for nearly 5 months, haunted by both the law and her own conscience. Every dream ended with the same image, Nelson lying in that bed, his blood staining her hands. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something deeper, a sorrow that sat too heavy to name. That's when she made the decision. Not out of fear, but out of inevitability. She would turn herself in. She didn't do it for mercy. She knew there would be none. The Bureau had made that clear with how they treated every captured outlaw. But she couldn't keep running. She was tired of sleeping with one eye open, tired of the constant disguises, tired of pretending she was still part of a world that had already ended. More than that, she was tired of being defined by the men she had followed. Nelson was gone. The others were gone. What was left for her now but the truth? On a gray April morning, she walked into the FBI field office in Chicago. No disguise, no lies, no trembling hands. Just Helen Gillis, the woman behind the myth. The agents recognized her immediately. The room went quiet as she stepped forward, the sound of her shoes echoing across the marble floor. "I'm here to surrender," she said simply. The agent in charge, a tall, stiff man with a face carved in stone, looked at her for a long moment before nodding to his men. "Helen Gillis," he said, "you're under arrest for harboring and aiding the nation's most wanted criminal." She didn't flinch as they cuffed her wrists. She didn't resist when they led her to the car. Outside, the press was already waiting, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions she didn't bother to answer. "Did you help him kill those agents? Were you there when he died? Do you have anything to say about babyface Nelson?" She kept her head down, her jaw set. She wouldn't give them what they wanted. The truth was hers alone. The trial was a spectacle. The government wanted blood, or at least a symbol of victory, and Helen became the perfect one. She was the last connection to Nelson, the living reminder of the chaos he had left behind. They painted her as complicit in every robbery, every killing, every act of defiance. The newspapers called her the gun Moll widow, the devil's darling, the woman who stood by a killer. But behind the headlines and the sensational stories was a quiet young woman who had loved too fiercely, followed too blindly, and paid the price for both. When she took the stand, she spoke softly but clearly. She admitted to traveling with Nelson, to hiding with him, to helping him escape capture. But when they asked if she had ever fired a gun, she said no. When they asked if she had ever wanted to leave, she hesitated, then said yes. "Why didn't you?" the prosecutor asked. Helen looked out across the courtroom, her eyes steady. "Because when you love someone like him," she said, "you don't just walk away. You hold on, even when you know it's already over." The courtroom fell silent. Even the prosecutor, for a brief moment, looked uncertain. In the end, she was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison for harboring a fugitive. It wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Hoover wanted to show the public that even women could be punished, that no one was above the law, but he also knew that making a martyr out of her would draw sympathy. So they kept her alive, locked her away, and let the story fade. Prison was its own kind of death. The days were long and colorless, filled with chores and silence. Helen kept to herself, rarely speaking to the other inmates. She spent most of her time reading or writing letters she never sent. Letters to Nelson, to her family, to a past that no longer existed. She would trace the ink with her fingers, then tear the pages to shreds before anyone could see them. But somewhere in that stillness, something inside her began to shift. She started to see the world differently, not through the haze of adrenaline and devotion that had once driven her, but through the clear, unflinching lens of reality. She began to realize that love, when mixed with desperation and danger, could destroy as easily as it could inspire. Nelson had been her whole world, but that world had been built on sand. When it fell, it buried them both. By the time she was released, the gangster era had ended. Dillinger was dead. Bonnie and Clyde were long gone. The Barkers were either in prison or shot to pieces. Hoover had won his war. The newspapers that once glorified the outlaws now glorified the men who killed them. And Helen Gillis, once one of the most wanted women in America, stepped out into a world that barely remembered her. She didn't go back to Chicago. There was nothing left for her there. Instead, she drifted quietly through the Midwest, taking on odd jobs under false names, living a life of anonymity. She worked as a waitress, a factory hand, a seamstress, whatever paid enough to keep her moving. The woman who had once ridden beside babyface Nelson now rode buses with housewives and farmers, her past buried under layers of ordinary. Sometimes late at night she would still dream of him. She'd see that wild grin, hear his voice calling her baby, feel the weight of his arm around her shoulders as they sped down an open road with the wind in their hair. In those dreams they were free again, no sirens, no fear, just the two of them against the world. But when she woke, there was only silence. Years later, when people spoke of babyface Nelson, they remembered the violence, the madness, the unrelenting rage. Few remembered Helen. She had become a footnote in someone else's legend. But if you looked closely, if you read between the lines, you could still find her there. The woman who stayed when everyone else ran. The one who loved a man the world called a monster. The one who buried him with her own hands. Time softened her story, turning her from an accomplice into a curiosity, then into a ghost. But Helen didn't mind. She had lived her share of headlines. What she wanted now was peace, and for the first time in her life she had it. And yet, there were nights when she would sit by a window, cigarette in hand, and stare out at the stars the way she used to in those old safe houses. The world outside would hum with the quiet pulse of life. Cars passing, dogs barking, wind in the trees. And for just a moment, she'd feel that same electric current she once felt beside Nelson. That dangerous, beautiful thing called freedom, but she didn't chase it anymore. She'd learned what it cost. The world had changed by the time Helen Gillis found herself standing on the other side of the prison gates. The wind that cut across the yard smelled cleaner somehow, as if it belonged to a place she no longer recognized. The guards barely looked at her when they handed her back the small box that held her possessions, an old hairbrush, a worn Bible, and a faded photograph of Nelson folded so many times the edges were nearly dust. It had been a long year, but the silence of confinement had reshaped her in ways that even she couldn't quite name. She had entered that place as the woman who wouldn't run, the defiant widow of the country's most dangerous outlaw. She walked out as something quieter, smaller perhaps, but harder to break. The first days of freedom were strange. She stayed at a boarding house under a false name, listening to the hum of radios in the hallways and the laughter of strangers downstairs. Sometimes she would hear a song she and Nelson used to dance to in cheap saloons, and her chest would tighten like a wound reopening. She had imagined that freedom would feel like release, but it didn't. It felt like exile. The noise of the world pressed against her from all sides, cars honking, children playing, trains clattering down the tracks, and she realized she no longer belonged in it. She had lived too long in hiding, too long in fear. She had become part of another time, one that the world wanted to forget. In those early weeks, she tried to find work, but it wasn't easy. Even with a new name, her face carried a kind of recognition that made people uneasy. They would look at her for a moment too long, their eyes narrowing, their minds working silently until something clicked. Some would whisper. Some would stop talking altogether. Once, a man behind a store counter dropped the newspaper he was reading, the headline still visible, "Widow of Babyface Nelson Released." She left before he could speak. After that, she started moving again, town to town, city to city, never long enough for anyone to notice her. She ended up in Milwaukee, working in a small diner just off the highway. The owner was an older woman named Ruth who didn't ask questions and didn't care about the past. "You work hard, you get paid," she told Helen, and that was all that mattered. The work was simple, coffee, eggs, pies, and for the first time in years, Helen found comfort in the ordinary rhythm of it. She wore an apron instead of a gun, listened to the radio instead of sirens, and learned to smile again, even if it never quite reached her eyes. But the nights were still long. After closing, she would walk home through the empty streets, her footsteps echoing against the pavement. Sometimes she would pass by the old movie theater and see the posters of crime pictures, men in fedoras, women with lipstick-stained cigarettes, gunfights in shadowed alleys, and she would feel that familiar ache in her chest. The world had turned her story into entertainment. Somewhere out there, people were sitting in darkened theaters, watching actors pretend to live the kind of life she had barely survived. They called it thrilling, glamorous. They cheered for the gangsters. But none of them knew the sound of a man dying in your arms. None of them knew the smell of blood or the weight of silence after the gunfire stopped. Still, Helen watched them sometimes. She would stand in the lobby until the manager told her to buy a ticket or move along. Once she stayed through an entire showing, sitting in the back row where no one could see her face. The movie was about Dillinger, his robberies, his women. His daring escape from Crown Point. The actress playing his girl was beautiful, fearless. Her hair perfect even when she was supposed to be running from bullets. The audience loved her. They loved the idea of her. And Helen sat there in the dark, thinking how strange it was that the world could love what it once condemned. She left before the credits finished rolling. Outside, the rain had started to fall, soft and cold against her skin. She walked without an umbrella, letting the water run down her face until she couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. Years passed like that, quietly, anonymously. The FBI stopped caring about her. The headlines moved on. New wars, new criminals, new scandals. The faces that once haunted her dreams faded into history books. But the past never really left her. It lingered like a shadow at the edge of every room. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain she heard the roar of a car engine or the crack of gunfire outside. Other nights, she'd wake to the sound of her own voice whispering his name. One summer evening in the 1940s, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of Nelson, one she hadn't seen before. He was sitting on the hood of a car, laughing, his arm draped around her shoulders. Someone had written on the back in faded ink, "They still remember." There was no signature, no explanation, but Helen kept it tucked inside her Bible after that. It reminded her that even if the world forgot her, it hadn't entirely forgotten him. She never remarried. Men came and went, co-workers, boarders, the occasional kind stranger who tried to make her laugh, but none of them reached her. There was always a part of her that stayed with Nelson, locked away in that frozen field in Illinois where his blood had stained the snow. Some nights, when she drank too much, she would talk to him as if he were still there beside her. She'd tell him about the news, about the people who came into the diner, about how much she missed him even though she tried not to. She would tell him she forgave him, for the fear, for the chaos, for everything. And sometimes, when the room was quiet enough, she'd imagine he forgave her too. By the 1950s, she was living in California, drawn by the promise of warmth and distance. She worked at a laundry by day and rented a small room in a house overlooking the ocean. The salt air helped her breathe easier. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink into the horizon, and think about how far she'd come from the girl she used to be. That girl, Helen Warziniak from Chicago, was long gone. Even Helen Gillis, the outlaw's wife, felt like someone else entirely. What was left was just a woman who had survived. She never spoke publicly about her life. Reporters tried to find her now and then, especially when new books or films about the gangster era appeared, but she refused every interview. She had spent too many years being defined by someone else's story. She wanted the rest of her life to belong only to her. The few who knew her during those final decades described her as kind, quiet, and distant. There was a sadness in her that never quite left, but also a strength that seemed carved from stone. In her later years, she began visiting churches more often. Not because she sought forgiveness, she had long made her peace with that, but because the quiet comforted her. She would sit in the back pew, watching the candles flicker, listening to the hum of whispered prayers, and for a few brief moments, the weight of the past would lift. She never confessed the details of her life to any priest. Some sins, she thought, weren't meant for absolution. They were meant to be carried quietly like a scar. As time went on, the legends of that era grew larger than life. The names became myth: Dillinger, Capone, Floyd, Nelson. They were turned into songs, movies, comic books. Young people romanticized them as rebels, as symbols of freedom against a corrupt system. Helen would hear those stories sometimes playing on the radio or being discussed at the diner counter, and she would smile faintly, knowing how little truth lived inside those myths. The real story, the one with all its blood and heartbreak, was buried under layers of glamour and nostalgia. No one wanted to remember the fear, the sleepless nights, the endless running. No one wanted to remember the women who waited in the dark, praying that the next gunfight wouldn't be the last. In her final years, she lived alone. The world had moved on, and she preferred it that way. She would walk to the market in the mornings, feed stray cats in the alley, and return home to sit by the window with her tea. Sometimes she'd look out at the streetlights flickering in the dusk and think about how life had a strange way of circling back. The same light that once illuminated her and Nelson's getaways now shone on the quiet streets where she waited for sleep. The same wind that had carried the sound of gunfire now rustled the leaves outside her door. The ghosts never left. They just changed shape. When Helen Gillis passed away in 1987, there were no headlines, no reporters, no grand obituaries. Just a small notice in a local paper. Helen W. Gillis, beloved sister and aunt, passed away peacefully at the age of 75. There was no mention of Babyface Nelson, no mention of the life she had lived in the shadows of America's most violent decade. Just peace at last. But for those who still cared to look, her name remained etched into the underbelly of history. Not as a villain, not even as a victim, but as something far more complicated. The woman who loved too fiercely, who stood by her man when the world turned against him, who refused to run even when running might have saved her. They called her the gun Moll, who wouldn't run. But maybe that wasn't the full truth. Maybe she wasn't running from the law or loyalty or even love. Maybe she just understood something most people never do, that no matter how far you go, you can't outrun yourself. In the end, Helen Gillis became what so many of them never got the chance to be. An old woman who outlived her legend. She carried the past like a phantom weight, invisible to the rest of the world but always there, reminding her of who she'd been and what it had cost. And maybe that was her final act of defiance, not the gunfights, not the loyalty, not even the love, but the simple act of surviving it all. Because in a world where men like Babyface Nelson burned bright and died fast, Helen endured. And in that endurance, in that quiet refusal to vanish completely, she found her own kind of power. By the time the world had truly forgotten the name Helen Gillis, the cities she once ran through had been reborn. Chicago's skyline stretched higher, its old speakeasies turned into restaurants and offices, its alleyways cleaned, its ghosts quietly sealed behind brick and neon. But in certain corners of the city, those narrow echoing streets where the past still clung to the walls, you could almost feel the old world stirring beneath the surface. The faint trace of smoke from the old cars, the lingering echo of gunfire that had once defined a generation. And if you listened closely enough, maybe you could still hear the laughter of a woman who refused to run. Helen never returned to Chicago after her release, but the city never quite left her. Every now and then she would dream of it, the fog rolling off the river, the way the street lamps cut through the darkness like tired sentinels. She'd see herself walking along Wabash Avenue, her coat pulled tight, her hair tucked beneath a hat, passing through crowds that didn't yet know who she was. The city in her dreams was always half real, half memory, shimmering like a reflection on water. It wasn't the Chicago of now, but the one she had lost. The one where she had danced with Nelson in smoky bars and heard the jazz bands play over the hum of illegal whiskey stills. Sometimes, she wondered what would have become of her if she'd never met him. It was a thought she used to push away, as if it were a betrayal to even imagine another life. But in the quiet years of her later days, it would come to her uninvited, a whisper of an alternate fate. Maybe she'd have married some factory worker, lived in a brick house on the south side, raised children, gone to church on Sundays, and complained about the price of milk like everyone else. Maybe she'd have been content. But then again, she knew she wasn't built for that kind of life. There was something in her, something restless, something wild, that would have found its way out one way or another. Even as a teenager, she'd always felt like she was waiting for something to happen. Something bigger, louder, more dangerous. Nelson had simply been the spark that lit that fuse. The world had offered her a dull sort of safety, and she had chosen the fire instead. And for all the pain it brought, for all the blood and heartbreak, she couldn't bring herself to regret it completely. Because for a brief burning moment she had lived, really lived, in the mid-1960s, when the gangster era became a subject of fascination again, spurred by movies, television, and nostalgia for the romantic criminals of the Depression. Helen began to receive letters from writers and journalists who had somehow tracked her down. They wanted her story, her truth, her words. They wanted to hear from the woman behind the man, the last witness to one of the bloodiest legends of American crime. She never answered, but she read everyone. Some were respectful, some were exploitative. One writer called her the last Moll of the American outlaw myth, a phrase that made her laugh bitterly. Another begged her to help him write a book, promising to tell her side of the story, the way it really happened. But Helen knew how that would end. The world didn't want her truth. They wanted their version of it. Clean, cinematic, tragic in just the right places. They wanted to make sense of something that had never made sense, to turn chaos into art. But her life wasn't art. It was survival. Still, one letter caught her attention. It came from a young woman studying history at Northwestern University. The handwriting was neat and careful. The girl wrote about how she'd been researching women in the gangster era and how Helen's story had moved her. "They make you out to be just a side character," the letter said. "But I think you were stronger than all of them." Helen read that line over and over. It was strange to see herself through someone else's eyes, not as an accomplice, not as a relic, but as something almost admirable. She didn't reply, but she tucked the letter into her Bible next to Nelson's photograph. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of something she hadn't felt since her youth, something dangerously close to hope. In her solitude, she often thought about the choices that had led her to that place, not in regret but in reflection. She understood now that the world wasn't divided into good and bad, guilty and innocent. It was murkier than that. People did what they had to do to survive. Nelson had robbed banks, killed men, defied the law, but he had also laughed, loved, and protected her with a kind of fierce loyalty that was both beautiful and terrifying. He was human in all the ways that made humans complicated, and she, by standing beside him, had become part of that complexity. She used to think of him as a storm, uncontrollable, destructive, but magnificent in its power. Now she saw him as a man who never learned how to live in the quiet moments between the chaos. Maybe that was what separated them in the end. She had learned to live in the quiet. On rare occasions, she would still catch a glimpse of him in the world around her. A young couple laughing on a motorcycle would remind her of the way they used to ride through the back roads, reckless and free. The sharp laugh of a man in a bar would carry an echo of his voice. Even the flash of police lights on a wet street would pull her back for an instant to those nights of endless running. But instead of fear, those memories brought her a strange kind of warmth now. The past no longer haunted her. It simply existed alongside her like a shadow she'd learned to live with. In the early 1970s, she moved again, this time to Oregon. She had grown tired of cities. The noise, the crowds, the reminders of what had been, it all felt too heavy. In a small coastal town, she found a modest cottage that looked out over the sea. She planted flowers in the garden, cooked simple meals, and spent her afternoons walking along the shore, collecting seashells like a child. To anyone who met her, she was just Mrs. Helen Morris, a quiet widow with kind eyes and a faint sadness she never spoke about. But every so often, someone older, someone who had lived through the Depression, would do a double take. They'd say she looked familiar. One man, a retired cop, once stopped her outside the post office. "You ever live in Illinois?" he asked, squinting at her as if trying to drag a memory from the fog. "Long time ago," she replied softly. He nodded slowly. "You look like someone I used to know." "Someone who made the papers once," Helen smiled faintly. "People used to say that a lot," she said. Then she walked away before he could ask anything else. The years blurred together after that. She grew older, slower. Her hair turned silver. Her hands trembled when she wrote, but her mind remained sharp. Sometimes she would take out that old photograph of Nelson, the one from the letter, and study it in the fading light. She would trace the outline of his face with her finger, memorizing every line, every curve, every ghost of a smile. It was as if she were afraid that if she stopped remembering, he would finally disappear. One evening, as she sat by the window watching the sunset, she whispered to the photograph, "You'd laugh if you saw me now, old, alone, feeding cats. You'd hate it." Then she smiled. "But I made it, Lester. I really did." When she finally passed away in her sleep, the world barely noticed. There were no reporters, no cameras, no curious writers at her door. Just a quiet funeral attended by a few neighbors and distant relatives who had only known her as Helen Morris. They spoke kindly of her, how gentle she was, how she always had a kind word, how she loved the sea. No one mentioned her past. No one knew. It wasn't until years later that a historian researching the Outlaw era stumbled across her death certificate and recognized the name hidden in the middle of it, Helen Gillis. He published a small article about her in a historical journal, calling her the forgotten survivor of a violent age. It circulated among enthusiasts of true crime and Depression-era history, but even then, her story was treated like a footnote, People were still more interested in the men, the gangsters, the killers, the legends. But a few readers saw something else in her story. They saw a woman who had lived through hell and walked out the other side. They saw resilience. They saw humanity. And maybe, in some small way, that was what Helen would have wanted. To be remembered not for her association with a killer, but for her endurance, her quiet strength, her refusal to let the world define her completely. In the end, her story became a whisper rather than a roar, a faint echo of a time when love and crime had been bound together by desperation and youth. But that whisper carried something the legends never did: truth. The truth that behind every infamous man stood someone who bore the weight of his choices, who lived with the aftermath when the guns went silent. Helen Gillis's life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the story the movies told. It was messy, tragic, and painfully real. But it was also proof that even in the darkest corners of history, there were glimmers of grace. She had lived through the rise and fall of an empire built on fear and fury, and when the dust settled, she was still standing. Somewhere, deep in the archives of forgotten files and faded newspapers, her name remains, small, almost invisible. But if you look closely, you can still see her shadow beside his. And maybe that's enough. Because while babyface Nelson burned fast and bright, Helen Gillis endured. And in the quiet aftermath of all that chaos, endurance is its own kind of legend. Years rolled forward like slow tides, and time began to wash over the story of Helen Gillis, softening its edges until only fragments remained. By the time the 1980s arrived, the world that had once known her kind, the world of desperate men with Tommy guns, dusty back roads, and flasks of bootleg whiskey, was long gone. In its place stood something glossier, louder, more detached from the hunger and survival that had once driven people to crime. Gangsters were no longer fugitives scraping by in the shadows. They were movie icons, their stories sold on screens and whispered about by a generation that had never known the smell of gunpowder in a closed car. Yet even then, as neon lights flickered over cinema posters of handsome outlaws and glamorous malls, Helen's ghost moved quietly through the cracks of history. There were no statues or memorials to her kind, no headlines celebrating her endurance. The men of her era, Nelson, Dillinger, Capone, were immortalized in ink and film, their crimes becoming folklore. But the women were left behind, their faces fading from the photographs, their names reduced to the margins of stories that had once been their lives. Helen would have understood this silence. She had always been the one who stood in the background, waiting, watching, surviving. But time, in its strange way, has a habit of circling back. In 1984, a Chicago-based journalist named Mark Hendricks stumbled across Helen's name while researching a feature about forgotten figures of the Depression era. He was a man fascinated by the ghosts of the past, the lost souls who had lived in the shadows of history's grand narratives. When he found an old file labeled Gillis Helen W. in a dusty county archive, curiosity took hold. Inside was little more than a birth record, a marriage certificate, and a death notice under the alias Helen Morris. No mention of her role in Nelson's story, no mention of her connection to the violent years that had scarred the Midwest. But Hendricks sensed something deeper. He began to dig. Through court records, newspaper archives, FBI reports. What he uncovered was not the myth of a gun moll clinging to a killer's arm, but the slow, tragic unraveling of a woman caught in a storm she didn't create. He found reports of her arrest after the Battle of Barrington, her quiet years in prison, her refusal to betray anyone even when the Bureau leaned hard on her. He found letters she'd written to her family, letters filled not with rage or pride, but with grief, longing, and a haunting humility. The more he read, the more he felt her presence. It was as if Helen had left breadcrumbs for anyone willing to see past the headlines. Hendricks began writing her story, not as a crime piece, but as a human one, a portrait of a woman who had loved deeply, endured more than most, and survived an era that devoured nearly everyone it touched. His article, "The Woman Who Wouldn't Run," appeared in a small Chicago magazine in 1986. It was modestly printed, with a black and white photo of Helen in her youth staring off to the side, her expression unreadable. The piece didn't make front pages, but it struck a quiet chord among readers. Hendricks described her not as a relic of gangster romance, but as a symbol of resilience, a woman who refused to break even as the world around her turned to ash. For the first time since her death, Helen's name returned to public conversation. Historians reached out to Hendricks for interviews. A few crime enthusiasts began to debate her role in Nelson's life, some painting her as a tragic figure, others as an accomplice who had chosen her fate. But what none of them could quite capture was the nuance Hendricks had found, that line between loyalty and survival, between love and destruction. In a strange twist of fate, one of those who read the article was the same historian who had once written that brief obituary calling her the forgotten survivor. He contacted Hendricks, and together they pieced together a fuller account of her life. They traveled to the old neighborhoods where she'd grown up, spoke to distant relatives who still remembered whispered stories about Aunt Helen, who'd run with a bad crowd but come home quiet and kind. They even located the small Oregon cottage where she had spent her final years. It was still standing, weathered and empty, its windows clouded with dust. In a drawer of the abandoned home, they found a single black and white photo tucked beneath a stack of yellowed letters. It was the same picture Helen had kept for decades. Nelson, smiling faintly. The edges of the photograph creased from being held too often. That image became the centerpiece of a short documentary produced later that decade, titled Helen and the Shadow of Nelson. It aired once on local television, narrated in that haunting, low tone that documentaries of that era favored. The story didn't sensationalize. Instead, it focused on her humanity, the girl from Chicago who became a fugitive not because she craved crime, but because she refused to abandon love. It spoke of her quiet years, her resilience, her refusal to sell her story even when poverty tempted her to. The program didn't make her famous, but it gave her a second life, a small, flickering light in the vast archive of forgotten names. And in that modest resurrection, her legend changed form. No longer the gun moll clinging to a killer's side, she became something far rarer, a symbol of loyalty that survived even when the dream collapsed. The documentary's release led to letters pouring into the station. Women wrote in saying they saw pieces of themselves in Helen, her stubbornness, her strength, her ability to endure heartbreak. A few old-timers claimed they'd once seen her, spoken to her, even shared a drink with her back in the days when Chicago still buzzed with illicit life. Most of those stories were likely embellished, but each one added another shade to the myth. In a way, Helen Gillis became larger in death than she had ever been in life. In the decades that followed, the fascination with Depression-era gangsters grew again. Movies and books romanticized the chaos, the style, the danger. But somewhere in that glossy mythos, the figure of Helen remained, a quiet counterpoint to all the noise. While others lived fast and died young, she had done something far more radical. She lived on. In 1993, a major film studio announced a new project based on babyface Nelson's life. The script painted him as a tragic anti-hero, caught between love and lawlessness. The actress cast to play Helen was glamorous, her lines few but memorable. She was written as both muse and martyr, a beautiful shadow trailing behind a doomed man. The movie was stylish, violent, and predictably successful. Critics praised its energy, its faithful recreation of a lost America. But one reviewer, writing for a small Chicago newspaper, offered a single quiet criticism. "They turned her into a symbol," he wrote. "When she was a person." That line stayed with people. It hinted at something more, something that no amount of screen polish could capture, the reality that behind every infamous man, there was someone whose life had been swallowed by his myth. In the years that followed, small groups of researchers and historians continued to tell Helen's story as its own narrative, separate from Nelson's shadow. One such historian, a woman named Carla Ruiz, published a book in 2004 titled Standing in the Fire, The Untold Story of Helen Gillis. It wasn't a bestseller, but it became a cult favorite among readers fascinated by women's roles in America's criminal past. Ruiz had spent years tracking down documents, letters, and photographs, and what she uncovered was remarkable. Helen had written more than 24 letters during her imprisonment, letters that had never been made public before. They revealed her wit, her intelligence, her loneliness. In one of them, she wrote, "They all think I was just there for the ride. But sometimes the only way to survive a storm is to hold on to something, even if that something is already sinking." That sentence alone changed how people remembered her. It became the defining quote associated with Helen Gillis, a testament to endurance, love, and the cruel contradictions of loyalty. Ruiz's book reframed her not as a side character but as a survivor of an era that devoured its own heroes. By the 2010s, Helen's story had begun to circulate in a new medium, the internet. True crime podcasts picked up her name, rediscovering her in a wave of renewed interest in forgotten outlaw women. They spoke of her in hushed, reverent tones, calling her the Moll who stayed, the woman who loved too long, the gun Moll who wouldn't run. Her story resonated with modern audiences who understood, perhaps more than ever, what it meant to stand beside someone dangerous and still find humanity in the wreckage. As documentaries evolved and History channels sought fresh narratives, Helen's name began appearing again, not as a footnote but as a headline. One episode titled Love and Gunfire, the true story of Helen Gillis, went viral, painting her as the heart of a tragedy rather than a participant in it. Viewers commented about how heartbreaking it was, how they couldn't believe she'd lived so long after losing everything. It was strange, in a poetic way, how time had rewritten her. Where once she had been seen as complicit, she was now viewed as courageous. The same silence that had once condemned her had become the thing that defined her grace. Her loyalty, her resilience, her refusal to glamorize or sell her story, all of it turned her from a forgotten fugitive into a quiet icon. In one of the last surviving interviews recorded from someone who had met her, a neighbor from Oregon described her in simple words. She was soft-spoken, polite, but you could tell she'd seen things most of us couldn't imagine. Sometimes she'd look out at the water for hours. I asked her once what she was thinking about, and she said, just making sure the past stays where it belongs. Maybe that was her final wish, to leave the past buried, to let the noise fade, to live out her days in peace. Yet, like all ghosts from America's darker chapters, the past never truly stayed buried. It lived on in stories and whispers in the retellings of those who found meaning in what others had dismissed. Today, if you walk through a museum dedicated to crime in America, you might find her name in a small corner exhibit, a photograph, a few newspaper clippings, maybe that same quote about surviving the storm. Visitors stop for a moment, glance, move on to the flashier displays. But for those who linger, there's something haunting about that faded smile. The smile of a woman who defied the narrative, who refused to run, and who, in the end, outlasted them all. Helen Gillis never wanted to be remembered. But she was. Not as a legend, not as a saint, but as something far rarer, a human being who lived through an inhuman time. And maybe that's all she ever needed to be. History has a strange way of bending around the people it forgets. By the time the 21st century came into full view, the world had become unrecognizable from the one Helen Gillis had once run through with a gun in her hand and the sound of sirens behind her. The cities she'd fled were now monuments of glass and light, their streets pulsing with electric veins instead of the echo of gunfire. Yet somewhere in the quiet corners of the internet, her name began to flicker again. Small, scattered mentions across true crime forums and YouTube channels that specialized in the ghosts of the American underworld. They called her the last Outlaws girl, the gun Moll who lived, the woman who wouldn't run. But these retellings were different from the old pulp narratives. There was empathy in the way people spoke of her now, curiosity about her silence, and respect for the endurance that defined her. Listeners were no longer just drawn to the glamour of the crime. They were drawn to the humanity buried underneath it. And in that new age of rediscovery, Helen Gillis found herself reborn not through the lens of tragedy or scandal, but through a kind of reverence. One of the first viral documentaries that truly reignited her story was an hour-long feature titled The Woman Beside the Gunman, released in 2018. It wasn't made by a major studio or a network, but by an independent filmmaker named Emma Raines, a young documentarian who had grown up fascinated by the stories of women history had pushed to the background. She had come across Helen's name while researching forgotten figures of the 1930s, and had been stunned to realize how little of Helen's own voice existed in the record. Every time I found her name, Raines later said in an interview, it was next to someone else's, Nelson's, Dillinger's, the FBI's. It was like she only existed in reflection. I wanted to give her her own light. The documentary was filmed in muted sepia tones, with soft jazz underscoring the narration. Raines retraced Helen's life from the tenements of Chicago to the final quiet days by the Oregon coast. She visited archives, interviewed historians, even tracked down descendants of Helen's relatives who still spoke about her in hushed, uncertain tones, as if the old stigma of her past still lingered, even 8 decades later. Rains didn't dramatize or romanticize the violence. She told the story with a calm, poetic realism that made it feel almost like a ghost story. The film's most haunting moment came near the end, when Rains read aloud one of Helen's prison letters. "I think the hardest thing in life is learning how to be left behind without becoming bitter. Some people fight the world until it kills them. Some of us just keep walking until it forgets." As the line played, the camera drifted across the Oregon coast where Helen had spent her final years, the waves rolling in under a gray sky. Viewers wrote in the comments that it felt like Helen herself was speaking to them from another lifetime. The documentary spread quickly. It was shared across social media, then picked up by true crime channels, podcasts, and history networks. People were struck by how modern Helen's pain felt, how the love and loss that had once seemed buried in the 1930s still echoed through time. She became a kind of symbol for endurance, for the quiet strength of women who had stood beside men who burned too bright and too fast. In the years that followed, Helen's name became a reference point for conversations about how women in history were often erased, misrepresented, or flattened into caricatures. Articles appeared in online magazines analyzing her story from feminist perspectives. One headline read, "The Woman Who Refused to Vanish, Helen Gillis and the Cost of Loyalty." Another declared, "Before Bonnie and Clyde, there was Helen." The renewed attention brought her a strange, belated kind of justice, not through courtrooms or fame, but through remembrance. Meanwhile, her story began to inspire artists. A Chicago-based playwright wrote a one-woman stage production called Helen, The Last Witness, blending real excerpts from her letters with imagined monologues about guilt, love, and the need to be remembered. The play premiered in a small theater and sold out its first week. The actress who portrayed Helen stood on a dark stage beneath a single hanging light, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You all came for the men with guns, but I'm still here. I'm the one who had to live with what they left behind." The audience sat silent, many moved to tears. Critics praised the production for its raw honesty. For once, Helen's story wasn't framed as a cautionary tale, it was framed as a human one. She wasn't a victim or a villain. She was a survivor. And in that transformation, something powerful happened. Her name began to drift into the mainstream again. By 2021, podcasts devoted entire episodes to her. One of them, Bloodlines and Ballads, did a 3-part series that reconstructed her final days, reading directly from the old letters and describing the contrast between the chaos of her youth and the serenity of her later life. The host concluded the final episode with the line, "In a world that celebrates those who go out in a blaze of glory, maybe we should remember the ones who lived quietly afterward." Maybe survival is the greater rebellion. That sentiment struck a chord. It spread across platforms, quoted and reshared, attached to Helen's image. In online discussions, people began to speak of her as a kind of unsung heroine of endurance, someone who had carried a century's worth of pain and yet managed to find peace. It was strange, almost poetic, that the woman who had once hidden from headlines now found herself living again through them. In Chicago, a museum dedicated to Prohibition-era history added a small exhibit in her honor. It wasn't grand or flashy, just a glass case containing photographs, newspaper clippings, and a short biography engraved on a brass plaque. Visitors would stop, often surprised to see a woman's face among the lineup of notorious men. Some lingered longer than others, reading the caption that ended with her own words, "I didn't run. Maybe I should have, but then maybe I wouldn't be here to tell it." Her story became a quiet counterweight to the endless stream of glorified gangster tales. She humanized the mythology. For every man who went down in a hail of bullets, there was someone left standing in the smoke, someone who had to bury the past and live in its shadow. Helen embodied that shadow, and through her, people began to understand the true cost of that kind of love. As her story grew in recognition, scholars began to dig deeper into the psychology of loyalty, trauma, and survival. They examined how women like Helen navigated lives defined by danger and devotion. One researcher, Dr. Lila Anton, published a paper titled "The Gun Moll Myth, Gender, Loyalty, and the Construction of Infamy." In it, She argued that Helen's endurance represented a form of rebellion, an act of agency in a world that saw her only as an extension of someone else's story. Refusing to run, Anton wrote, wasn't a sign of submission. It was a declaration of strength. Helen stayed not because she was powerless, but because she chose to face the storm head-on. That reinterpretation of her legacy transformed how she was remembered. Her name began appearing not only in crime histories, but also in discussions about identity, resilience, and the invisible labor of survival. Students wrote essays about her. Professors cited her in lectures about forgotten women of the 20th century. It was as if, after nearly a century of silence, Helen had finally found her voice through the voices of others. In 2024, a biographical film was announced, The Gun Moll Who Wouldn't Run, directed by Emma Raines, the same filmmaker who had made the original documentary years earlier. This time it was a full-scale production with a major actress cast as Helen and the story told entirely from her perspective. The film opened not with gunfire or robbery, but with Helen sitting by her window in Oregon, older and reflective, her voice narrating her memories. "They tell the story of the men," she says in the opening line, "but I remember the silences." The movie was powerful, somber, and deeply human. Critics called it a masterpiece of restraint, a love letter to the forgotten. Audiences responded with emotion, flooding social media with messages about how Helen's life had moved them. The film's final shot, Helen walking alone along the shoreline, disappearing into the mist, became an image people couldn't shake. It was haunting, beautiful, and painfully symbolic of her life, fading from view, yet forever part of the landscape. After nearly 90 years, Helen Gillis had finally stepped out of the shadows of the men who had defined her. She became her own story, a testament to how even the quietest lives can leave the deepest marks. Today, her name appears not just in the archives of crime history, but in the hearts of those who find meaning in survival. Her story is told not as a tragedy, but as a reminder of the resilience that exists in those who endure what others cannot. The irony, of course, is that Helen never asked for any of it. She never sought fame, redemption, or attention. All she wanted was peace. And perhaps, in the way her story now resonates, gentle but enduring, she finally found it. If you stand by the coast of Oregon on a misty morning, when the waves crash against the rocks and the gulls call overhead, you might almost imagine her there, not as a ghost, but as part of the wind itself, watching, waiting, free at last from the weight of memory. The spring of 1934 rolled across the Midwest like a whisper before a storm. It was the season of manhunts and headlines, of public enemies and the ordinary faces that stood beside them. For Helen Gillis, it was the season that would decide her fate. The moment when the quiet girl from Chicago's back streets would stand at the crossroads of love and survival, between the law and the outlaw who owned her heart. By now, she was no longer just a name whispered in the speakeasies or scribbled in police ledgers as Dillinger's associate. She was babyface Nelson's Moll, the woman who never flinched, never ran, never turned her back on him, even when the walls of the underworld began to close in. By March, the country was still reeling from the death of John Dillinger's right-hand man, and the Chicago underworld had turned into a pressure cooker. The Bureau of Investigation had stepped up its campaign against the so-called public enemies, a term that J. Edgar Hoover had spun into a national crusade. Newspapers painted the outlaws as villains and heroes in equal measure, and the public devoured every word. Nelson, George Gillis, as Helen sometimes still called him in the quiet of their nights, was at the center of it all. He was fast, unpredictable, and violent beyond reason, but there was something magnetic in him that drew Helen closer, even as he spiraled further into darkness. Their hideouts shifted constantly, from rundown farmhouses in Wisconsin to rented cabins in Minnesota, and then south again through Illinois. The faces around them changed too, gang members dying, disappearing, or fleeing the country as the Bureau's noose tightened. Yet through all of it, Helen stayed. She cooked meals on wood stoves, watched through half-drawn curtains while George cleaned his weapons, and slept beside him in cheap motels with a gun on the nightstand. There were moments when he would reach for her hand in the dark, whispering that they'd make it out, that one big score would set them free. But both of them knew better. In the world they lived in, no one ever truly got out. Helen's loyalty was tested in the small, unseen ways first. She learned to spot unmarked cars, to tell when a stranger lingered too long at the diner counter. Once in Sioux Falls, she noticed a man across the street pretending to read a newspaper. She tugged George's sleeve, murmuring under her breath, and within minutes they were gone, slipping out the back door before the law could close in. Another time, when the gang was hiding near Clear Lake, Helen was the one who rode into town to buy supplies. Her heart pounded as she walked past the wanted posters plastered on the general store's wall, her own face among them, labeled armed and dangerous. The clerk's eyes flicked to her and lingered just a little too long. She smiled, thanked him, and walked out calmly. When she got back to the cabin, her hands trembled as she unpacked the groceries. George kissed her cheek, calling her his lucky charm, but she felt no luck in the way the world seemed to shrink around them. By midsummer, their luck finally began to crack. The Bureau had grown smarter, more coordinated. Agents moved in silence now, cross-checking sightings, tracking license plates, building a web that stretched across state lines. Nelson's temper flared with every close call. He hated authority, hated the thought of being cornered. Helen watched him pace rooms with a cigarette burning down between his fingers, muttering about Hoover, about how they'd never take him alive. Sometimes he'd slam his fist into the wall, shouting that he'd rather die than go to prison again. Those nights, Helen said nothing. She'd just sit beside him, eyes downcast, silently wondering how long she could hold on before his rage consumed them both. Then came the Little Bohemia Lodge. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a secluded hideout in the Wisconsin woods where Nelson, Dillinger, and the rest of the gang could rest. But fate, as it always did in those days, had other plans. On the night of April 22, 1934, the Bureau descended on the lodge in a botched raid that turned into chaos. Bullets tore through the night air, splintering the silence. Helen was in one of the back rooms when it started, and she could still recall the sound, sharp, deafening, a symphony of panic. She grabbed what she could, heart pounding, as Nelson shouted orders. They escaped through a side window, stumbling through the trees under the flash of gunfire. They made it out alive, but the raid had cost them dearly. Several agents were dead, civilians caught in the crossfire, and the newspapers had a new headline: Babyface Nelson escapes bloody gun battle. The Bureau's response was immediate and merciless. They swore to bring him down no matter the cost. Helen knew then that there would be no more hiding. They were no longer fugitives on the run. They were hunted animals. The following months were a blur of movement. They traveled by night, slept in barns and abandoned cars, living off stolen food and the few dollars they could scrounge. The once flamboyant Nelson was now gaunt, restless, consumed by paranoia. Helen saw the change in him, the twitch in his jaw, the flicker in his eyes when a car backfired. He'd sit for hours cleaning his Thompson as though the rhythm of it kept him sane. But there were also moments, fleeting and fragile, when he'd look at her and smile. And for a heartbeat, he was the same boy she'd fallen in love with on those Chicago streets. She held on to those moments like lifelines, even as the rest of the world faded to dust around them. In September, they found refuge on a small farm near Barrington, Illinois. The farmer didn't ask questions, and Helen offered to help with chores to keep suspicion low. They stayed there for a few weeks, long enough for Helen to feel a dangerous sense of calm. She milked cows at dawn, hung laundry in the sun, and sometimes imagined what it would be like if they could stay. But every night she'd see the fear in Nelson's eyes as he read the papers, the headlines growing bolder, the Bureau closing in. He'd mutter names: Dillinger dead, Pretty Boy Floyd gone, and he knew his turn was coming. One night, as autumn crept in, Helen found him sitting alone outside, staring into the darkness. He told her that if anything happened, she needed to run. She shook her head, tears glinting in her eyes, and said, "I won't run, George. Not from you." He smiled sadly, reached out, and brushed her hair back. "You're too good for this," he whispered. "Too good for me." She didn't answer. They both knew it didn't matter anymore. The line between good and bad had blurred long ago, swallowed by the gun smoke and sirens of their life on the run. By November, the Bureau had traced Nelson to the Chicago area. Agents were on high alert, and the Midwest was crawling with men eager for the glory of taking him down. Helen felt it in her bones, the tension, the inevitability of it all. Every day felt like a countdown. Nelson was restless, pacing, talking about one last stand, as if he could still write his own ending. Helen followed him, her faith unbroken but her heart heavy. Somewhere deep down, she knew how this story would end, and still she stayed. And so it came, on a cold morning at the end of November, near Barrington. Helen sat in the car as Nelson and his partner sped down the road, a Bureau sedan on their tail. The gunfire erupted before she could even breathe. Nelson shouted for her to get down, and she did, clutching the dashboard as bullets shattered the windshield. When it was over, when the smoke cleared and the cars were riddled with holes, she could smell the sharp, metallic scent of blood in the air. Nelson slumped beside her, his shirt soaked red. He tried to smile, whispering something she couldn't quite hear, and then his eyes went distant. Helen called his name, but he was already gone. For hours she sat there in silence, holding his lifeless hand. The sound of sirens grew closer, but she didn't move. She could have run then, maybe she should have, but she stayed. When the agents finally arrived, they found her there, calm and defiant, refusing to leave his side. They called her the gun Moll who wouldn't run, and that name followed her for the rest of her life. After Nelson's death, Helen was taken into custody. The headlines screamed her name again, branding her as both villain and victim. The prosecutors wanted to make an example out of her, but the public saw something different. Not a cold-blooded criminal, but a woman trapped by love and circumstance. She served her time quietly, never speaking against Nelson, never revealing more than she had to. When she was released, she vanished from the limelight, fading into the gray corners of America where the noise of the past couldn't reach. In her later years, those who knew her said she rarely spoke of those days. When she did, her eyes would drift, as if she were staring back into another world, one of smoke-filled rooms and sirens in the night. Some said she regretted it all. Others believed she carried her loyalty to the grave, but perhaps in her heart, Helen Gillis had made peace with the only truth that ever mattered to her, that she had stood by the man she loved, no matter the cost. Because in the end, she was not just a footnote in a gangster's story. She was the heartbeat behind it, the silent witness to an age where loyalty was measured in blood, and love was as dangerous as any bullet fired in the dark. The years after Barrington were a blur of silence and survival. For Helen Gillis, the noise of gunfire that had once echoed through her life was replaced by the soft, relentless ticking of time. The world moved on without her, the newspapers printing new names, new crimes, new legends. Dillinger, Floyd, Nelson. They were ghosts of another age now, fading into the mythology of America's outlaw past. But for Helen, every dawn was still haunted by the echo of that last day, the image of George bleeding out beside her as the light drained from his eyes. The government made a show of her arrest. When agents led her in, photographers clamored for a shot of the notorious gun Moll. The flashbulbs popped like miniature gunfire, blinding her momentarily. But Helen didn't flinch. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow but unbroken. One reporter shouted a question. "Why didn't you run?" And she didn't answer. She just turned her gaze toward the window, where the November sky hung gray and cold. In that silence, she became a symbol, though no one could agree on what she symbolized. To some, she was the last remnant of the gangster era, a woman complicit in bloodshed and lawlessness. To others, she was something far more tragic, a woman who had loved too deeply, too blindly, and paid the price for it. Her trial was quieter than expected. The government didn't need to make her into a monster. Nelson's reputation had already done that for them. They portrayed her as the accomplice, the one who helped him evade capture, who shared in his crimes. But even the prosecutors seemed unsure how far to push it. She was only 23. She looked small in the courtroom, her hands folded neatly in her lap as witnesses recounted the chaos at Little Bohemia, the bloody aftermath at Barrington. Each name, each gun, each body was a link in a chain they tried to fasten around her neck. But when the verdict came, it wasn't death or life imprisonment. She was sentenced to a term that would allow her to see daylight again, a few years to atone for the sins of love and loyalty. Prison was a different kind of hell. For someone who had lived her life on the run, every locked door was a reminder of what she'd lost. The clang of metal, the shuffle of feet, the endless hours under harsh fluorescent lights. They all pressed down on her like the weight of years. But she adapted. She kept her head down, worked in the laundry, followed the rules. The guards said she was polite, quiet, almost invisible. But sometimes at night they'd hear her crying softly, her voice barely a whisper through the bars. One of them once asked her what she was crying for. She just said, "For the things I can't forget." She was released in 1939, stepping out into a world that had already changed. The Depression was easing, the country gearing up for war, and the faces in the headlines were soldiers and politicians now, not outlaws and Molls. Helen walked free with a small bag of possessions and no real place to go. Chicago was still there, of course, the city that had raised her, loved her, and betrayed her. But it didn't feel the same. The old speakeasies were gone, the neighborhoods gentrified or forgotten. The people who once whispered her name now crossed the street when they saw her. She wasn't Helen Gillis, the girl, anymore, or even the woman who loved babyface Nelson. She was a relic of a time most wanted to forget. Still, she tried to build a life. She found work under a false name at a factory, stitching uniforms for the army. Her hands were steady, her back strong, and no one asked questions. She kept to herself, renting a small apartment above a grocery store where the sounds of the city filtered up through the thin floorboards. Car horns, laughter, footsteps. At night, she'd sit by the window and smoke, watching the world go by. Sometimes, when the wind carried the right scent, oil, dust, the faint tang of cigarettes, she could almost imagine that she was back in that old car, George beside her, the road stretching out like a promise. But then the illusion would break, and she'd be alone again, staring at her own reflection in the glass. Years passed quietly. Helen stayed out of trouble, kept her name out of the papers, but the past had a way of finding her, even when she wanted to forget it. Occasionally, a reporter would track her down, asking for an interview about Nelson, about Dillinger, about those wild days when she was young and the world burned bright. She always refused. "That life's gone," she'd say softly. "Ain't nothing left to talk about." But once, when a young journalist persisted, asking her what it had been like to love a man like Nelson, she gave a small, wistful smile. "It was like holding on to fire," she said. "Beautiful, until it burns you down." The Bureau, for its part, moved on too. The files on the old outlaws gathered dust in Washington, their names fading from active memory into history. But among the agents, there was still a kind of grudging respect for Helen. She had never betrayed anyone, never tried to barter her freedom for information. When questioned, she'd simply say, "I told you everything I know." Some believed she carried secrets to her grave, that she knew more about hidden money or buried weapons than she ever let on. But if she did, she kept them locked away, like everything else she'd buried deep inside. The war came and went, and with it, an entire generation's sense of what heroism and sacrifice meant. The gangsters of the 30s seemed almost quaint by comparison. Helen grew older, the hard edges of her face softening, her hair streaked with gray. She moved often, never staying too long in one place, as if the habit of running still pulsed in her veins. But she was no longer fleeing from the law or from danger. She was fleeing from memories, from the ghosts that followed her no matter where she went. In the 1950s, a wave of nostalgia swept through America. Movies, books, and pulp magazines revived the legend of the Depression-era outlaws. Babyface Nelson's name surfaced again, this time painted in celluloid and ink. Some stories portrayed him as a ruthless killer, others as a tragic anti-hero. And always, somewhere in the background, was the mysterious woman, the gun Moll who had stood by his side to the bitter end. Helen would see those portrayals sometimes, glimpsed in movie posters or tabloid headlines, and she'd feel an ache deep in her chest. The faces on the screen weren't them, not really. They were ghosts of ghosts, made pretty and shallow for an audience that wanted thrills, not truth. No one could ever capture the smell of gunpowder in the cold night air, or the way George's hand would tremble just slightly when he wasn't sure what came next. One evening, while working as a cleaner in a downtown Chicago office, she overheard two young men talking about the new film based on the Dillinger gang. They laughed about how romantic it must have been, living fast and free. Helen just kept mopping, her eyes lowered. When one of them asked her if she'd ever heard of those old gangsters, she said quietly, "More than you think." He laughed, thinking she was joking. She smiled faintly, but her eyes were somewhere else entirely. As time wore on, her past became less a burden and more a private piece of history, something she carried not with pride, but with a strange kind of tenderness. She began attending church again, sitting in the back pew where no one would recognize her. The priest once asked her if she wanted to confess, but she said she already had, long ago, to herself. She didn't need forgiveness anymore. What she needed was peace. There were rumors, of course. Some said she remarried under another name. Others swore she lived out her final years in California, working as a nurse or a seamstress. But the truth was simpler. She lived quietly, modestly, with a faded photograph of George in a drawer, the same one that had been printed on 1,000 wanted posters. His eyes still looked boyish in that photo, the curls on his forehead almost innocent. Sometimes, when the night was still, she'd take it out, trace her fingers over his face, and whisper, "You got what you wanted, didn't you? You went out blazing." Then she'd fold it back up and return it to its place. Helen Gillis died in obscurity, far from the headlines that had once chased her. No reporters came to her funeral. No cameras flashed. The few who knew her in her final years described her as kind, reserved, with an air of quiet sadness she never quite shed. She didn't talk much about the past, but every so often she'd say something that hinted at the fire still smoldering deep inside. Once she told a neighbor, "People think the hardest part is losing someone. But it's not. It's living afterward, knowing you can't tell anyone who they really were." In the years that followed, her story drifted into the footnotes of American history, overshadowed by the louder legends of the men she had known. Yet among those who study the old underworld, Helen remains a figure of fascination. Not because of what she did, but because of what she refused to do. She never betrayed. She never ran. And in an era where loyalty was as fleeting as a bullet's flight, that made her one of the rarest kinds of criminals. One with a heart that stayed true even when everything else fell apart. If you listen closely, you can still feel her presence in the ghost stories that cling to Chicago's old neighborhoods. In some of the bars near Lincoln Avenue, the old-timers still whisper about a woman who used to come in alone, order a whiskey neat, and stare at the door like she was waiting for someone who'd never arrive. Maybe it was her, maybe it wasn't. But the legend of Helen Gillis lives on in those whispers, in that shared, unspoken understanding of what it means to love too fiercely in a world that punishes love like that. For Helen, the story was never about glory or infamy. It was about survival, about holding on to something human amid the ruin. She was a girl who fell in love with a man the world called a monster, and she never looked away, not even when the world demanded it. And maybe in that unwavering devotion, she became something the world didn't know how to name. Not hero or villain, but a testament to the kind of loyalty that can't be reasoned with, only felt.